Nestled in a picturesque suburb, the neighborhood was a tapestry of well-maintained homes adorned with flourishing gardens and neatly trimmed lawns. Each house, a reflection of its owner's pride, created an inviting atmosphere marked by friendly waves and smiles exchanged between neighbors. Children laughed as they played in the safe streets, while residents engaged in warm conversations over freshly brewed coffee or weekend barbecues. This tight-knit community relied heavily on its homeowners association, HOA, to preserve its tranquility and aesthetic appeal. The HOA was central to maintaining the neighborhood's charm, organizing seasonal events and monitoring compliance with community standards. They ensured that everyone followed the rules, which were designed to uphold property values and foster a sense of pride among residents. For most homeowners, their presence was reassuring, creating a shared understanding of what it meant to be part of this idyllic enclave. However, beneath this facade of harmony lay an undercurrent of tension and bureaucracy that would soon unravel. Our protagonist had always been enamored with their home, a quaint bungalow with white picket fencing and flower beds that seemed to bloom brighter each spring. They found joy in tending to their garden, often sharing the harvest with neighbors, embodying the essence of community spirit. Life felt predictable yet content, framed by the support of the HOA that enforced tidy living. Yet as time passed, whispers began circulating about issues affecting some properties, flooding incidents, and sewer problems. Initially dismissed, these reports became impossible to ignore when our protagonist faced raw sewage gushing onto their beloved land one fateful afternoon. Panic washed over them as they stood witness to a horrific scenario that transformed their corner of paradise into a distressing nightmare. The initial shock morphed into mounting frustration as they turned to the HOA for assistance. The once trusted institution seemed mired in red tape, responding slowly while shifting responsibility and offering empty promises that only added to their despair. What had begun as an idyllic existence rapidly spiraled downward into chaos, a calamity prompting our protagonist to confront the very organization meant to safeguard their neighborhood's harmony. The day began like any other, with sunlight streaming through the leaves of the protagonist's vibrant garden. Yet the tranquility shattered in an instant when they stepped outside to find their once lush backyard transformed into a grotesque landscape. A noxious tide of muddy brown water swiftly overtook the flower beds, creeping ominously toward their home. Panic clawed at their chest as the realization set in. Raw sewage was flooding their land. Rushing to assess the damage, the protagonist felt a wave of repulsion wash over them, not just from the sight and smell, but from the sinking feeling that their safe haven had been irreparably tainted. The reality was horrific. This was no small mishap, but an unrelenting torrent of filth that threatened their health and well-being. With every splatter that hit their shoes, visions of bacteria and disease danced in their mind, transforming the comfortable familiarity of their home into a hazardous zone. As they stood at the edge of their flooded paradise, a deep sense of violation surged within them. Memories flooded back, family gatherings on that very lawn, children playing in what used to be a safe environment, laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Now all of it was overshadowed by a thick stench and an overwhelming sense of dread. The protagonist's heart raced as they envisioned potential health impacts for themselves, their family, and their pets. With shaky hands, they called for help, hoping for quick responses from both emergency services and the HOA. Each passing minute felt like an eternity as they waited for assistance that too often felt like it was never coming. Their emotional turmoil intensified. Feelings of helplessness morphed into anger as thoughts raced about how something like this could happen under the watchful eye of caretakers meant to uphold standards. Days turned into sleepless nights spent worrying about health risks and lost property value. It became increasingly clear that this flooding was not just a physical calamity, but a profound invasion of their peace, a harsh reminder that trust in the HOA's oversight had been misplaced. The emotional toll mounted, pushing the protagonist into a state where they could no longer tolerate inaction. This was no longer simply about property damage. It was about reclaiming control against an entity blinking away responsibility while their lives unraveled. In the wake of the sewage disaster, the protagonist turned to the HOA, hoping for swift assistance. Initially, representatives assured them that help was on the way, promising everything from immediate assessments to repairs. The words were comforting but felt increasingly hollow as hours stretched into days without meaningful action. Each call made to the HOA was met with vague updates and bureaucratic jargon, creating a frustrating cycle of unfulfilled promises. The first few messages from the HOA seemed promising. They expressed concern for the affected homeowners and emphasized their commitment to address any issues. However, as time passed, these reassurances morphed into excuses. "We're currently assessing the situation" became a common refrain, paired with statements about needing to gather more information before taking action. The protagonist found themselves staring at their flooded yard while listening to endless justifications over the phone that offered no tangible solutions. Compounding this frustration was an undeniable sense of blame circulating within the community. As rumors spread about who was responsible for the sewage leak, whether it was aging infrastructure or mismanagement, neighbors began pointing fingers at one another. The once cohesive atmosphere of camaraderie turned tense as fear and uncertainty seeped into conversations. Some residents blamed tree roots. Others speculated about improper maintenance on the part of the HOA itself. Instead of uniting against a common problem, they appeared fragmented and distrustful. The protagonist felt caught in this web of confusion and anger, trapped not only by their own predicament but also by an HOA that seemed more focused on deflecting responsibility than offering solutions. Each passing day without action fed their mounting anxiety. With every delay, hope dwindled further. As they observed community members discussing potential liabilities in hushed tones or keeping their distance over fears of contagion from the flooding, it became clear that trust in the HOA's governance was eroding quickly. Residents began to question whether making complaints would lead anywhere productive or simply reinforce their frustrations. What began as a simple plea for help had transformed into a bureaucratic nightmare, one that left our protagonist feeling isolated and powerless against an organization they had once trusted to maintain not just their property values but also their peace of mind. As frustration mounted with the HOA's inaction, the protagonist felt an urgent need to understand their legal rights and the obligations of the organization meant to protect their community. They delved into research, poring over local regulations governing sewage management and the responsibilities typically upheld by homeowners associations. What started as a quest for knowledge quickly turned into an eye-opening journey through legal jargon and municipal documents, revealing a patchwork of rules and guidelines that pointed towards the HOA's undeniable accountability in situations like theirs. Hours turned into days spent at local libraries and government offices, sifting through paperwork in search of answers. The protagonist learned that local laws mandated prompt responses to sewage-related emergencies and established specific protocols for HOAs to follow in managing communal infrastructure. With every revelation, the burden of frustration grew heavier. It became painfully apparent that the HOA's promises of assistance were more than just unfulfilled words. They were breaches of duty. Armed with this newfound knowledge, the protagonist began to construct a detailed timeline of events, documenting calls made to the HOA, the assurances given, and the delays experienced. Each entry reinforced the growing sense of betrayal they felt. What had initially been perceived as a minor inconvenience had spiraled into a significant legal grievance, and the realization that the HOA was failing in its responsibility fueled their anger even further. Friends and neighbors began to notice a shift in them as they delved deeper into advocacy. The protagonist became more vocal, attending community meetings and engaging other homeowners in discussions about the HOA's role. Many shared their own frustrations, revealing a community fractured not only by the flooding but also by the lack of leadership from an organization that was supposed to guide them. Yet, despite gathering support from fellow residents, the overwhelming bureaucracy of the HOA began to loom larger in their mind. The promise of collective action felt futile against an entity entrenched in red tape and evasive tactics. With each passing day without resolution, their helplessness morphed into determination, fueling an emerging desire for a more aggressive stance. The time for passive waiting was over. It was time to reclaim their home, dignity, and community from an organization that seemed all too comfortable in its complacency. After weeks of unanswered calls, empty promises, and bureaucratic runarounds, the protagonist reached a breaking point. They sat in their living room, surrounded by stacks of documents and notes chronicling the HOA's failures. The weight of frustration was palpable, and a fierce sense of injustice ignited within them. No longer willing to rely on an organization that had repeatedly let them down, they decided it was time to take matters into their own hands. The turning point came late one evening as they stared out at their flooded yard, where remnants of the disaster still lingered like a haunting reminder of the HOA's neglect. An idea began to take shape, a bold and audacious plan that would send a clear message to the HOA about accountability. Instead of waiting for help that would never arrive, they resolved to confront the source of their problems directly. The protagonist envisioned flooding the HOA office not with sewage, but with concrete. It was an unconventional idea born out of desperation and anger, yet it felt like the only way to make an impact and reclaim some semblance of power in this situation. They began sketching out a plan, meticulously detailing every step needed to execute this operation without causing harm to anyone but making an undeniable statement. As they plotted this course of action, adrenaline coursed through their veins. This act would symbolize the culmination of their frustrations, their fight against negligence and complacency. They started gathering supplies discreetly, seeking out materials needed for their plan while keeping conversations casual to avoid raising any suspicions among neighbors or HOA members. In parallel, they reached out to like-minded residents who shared similar grievances. It became clear that many felt powerless against the HOA's inaction. Together, they formed a small alliance united by a common goal, demanding accountability from an organization that had overstepped its bounds. This newfound camaraderie bolstered their resolve, transforming individual frustration into collective determination. As plans took shape, the protagonist felt empowered for the first time since the disaster began. The prospect of taking action filled them with both excitement and fear. It was a gamble that could either ignite change or escalate tension within the community. Yet, standing at this crossroads, they understood that waiting passively was no longer an option. The time had come to rise up and make their voices heard. Concrete would be poured not just in the physical sense, but as a protest against neglect and broken promises. With a renewed sense of purpose, the protagonist meticulously crafted their audacious plan to flood the HOA office with concrete. This was not merely a spontaneous outburst. It was a carefully calculated act of defiance against an organization that had neglected its responsibilities. The logistics of their strategy were as important as the symbolic weight behind it. Concrete would serve as a physical manifestation of the frustration they felt, solidifying their demand for accountability. First, they scoured the internet for supplies and resources. A local construction store became their go-to place, where they discreetly purchased bags of quick-drying concrete mixture, tools, and protective gear. The protagonist spent evenings researching methods to mix and pour concrete efficiently while ensuring safety precautions were in place. They quickly learned about the importance of timing. The ideal conditions for pouring concrete meant selecting a day when the weather was dry and mild to prevent any mishaps. In addition to gathering materials, they mapped out a timeline for executing the plan. Timing was crucial. They intended to strike during a weekend when HOA offices were closed, minimizing the risk of being caught and ensuring that their message would have an immediate impact on Monday morning when staff returned. To bolster their resolve, they enlisted the help of neighbors who were also fed up with the HOA's negligence. Together, they formed a small team, distributing tasks. Some would handle mixing and pouring while others kept watch. The motivations behind this drastic action ran deep. For the protagonist, this bold move symbolized reclaiming control over a situation that had spiraled beyond their grasp. They wanted to demonstrate that inaction would no longer be tolerated and that residents could no longer remain passive in the face of repeated failures from those meant to represent them. The act of flooding the office with concrete represented not only frustration but also unity, a strong message that negligence has consequences. As plans progressed, excitement mingled with dread. This was uncharted territory filled with risks but also an exhilarating chance to enact change. Each member of the group understood the stakes involved, aware that this move could escalate tensions within the community but believing fervently that their voices had been silenced long enough. As they prepared to put their plan into motion, deeper meanings emerged. Pouring concrete would symbolize fixing not just broken infrastructure, but also restoring integrity within their community. It was an act born from desperation, yet it harbored hope, a testament to turning collective anguish into decisive action against neglect and complacency. The night had arrived, and the protagonist stood outside the HOA office, heart racing with a mix of excitement and anxiety. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the building, amplifying the tension in the air. Their small team gathered nearby, each member sharing anxious glances, knowing they were about to cross a threshold into uncharted territory. This was a defining moment, one that would resonate throughout their community. As they began mixing the concrete under the cover of darkness, every sound seemed amplified, the clinking of tools, the soft whispers exchanged among team members, and the distant rustling of leaves. Time felt both suspended and fleeting. Every minute weighed heavily as they prepared to execute their plan. The stakes were high. Failure could lead to legal repercussions or even confrontation with law enforcement. Yet this urgency only spurred them on. Once ready, they moved toward the entrance of the HOA office with buckets of concrete in hand, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Their hearts beat in sync as they approached, knowing that this act would serve as a cathartic release for all their pent-up frustration. However, just as they reached the door, an unexpected obstacle emerged, A security guard appeared from around the corner, seemingly out of nowhere. Panic surged through the group as they quickly ducked behind a nearby car, holding their breath. The guard scanned the area but did not seem to notice them lurking in the shadows. Recognizing this as a potential turning point, the protagonist whispered instructions to hold still and remain quiet until he passed by. After what felt like an eternity, he eventually moved on, and relief washed over them as they regained their courage. With newfound determination bolstered by overcoming that initial scare, they pressed ahead. They stealthily poured concrete just inside the entrance before retreating back into the night's cover. Each bucket poured symbolized not only their anger but also a collective demand for accountability from an organization that had let them down time and again. The anticipation built with every passing second. They knew that come morning, when HOA staff returned to find their office flooded with concrete, it would send shockwaves through both their ranks and the surrounding community. As dawn approached and they completed their task, exhilaration mixed with apprehension filled them, a potent reminder that while this act was born from frustration, it also held immense potential for change. In those final moments before leaving the scene, they exchanged silent nods, each one recognizing that by standing together against complacency and neglect, they had transformed a moment of desperation into an act of empowerment. This was not merely vandalism, it was a bold statement demanding attention and accountability for years of negligence. The morning after the concrete flooding, chaos erupted in the HOA office. Staff arrived to find their entrance obscured by a solid mass of concrete, and bewildered expressions turned into anger as they assessed the scene. Panic spread quickly through the office as calls were made to local authorities, and soon enough, news of the incident rippled through the community like wildfire. Neighbors began to gather outside the HOA office, drawn by curiosity and rumors that had already begun circulating about the audacious act. Reactions ranged from outrage to clandestine admiration. Some residents voiced their disapproval, claiming vandalism could never be justified, while others eagerly speculated about who might be behind it, their whispers tinged with excitement for the boldness of it all. Many who had felt powerless under the HOA's governance found themselves emboldened by this unexpected defiance. As local law enforcement arrived on the scene, taking stock of the situation, tensions rose among those gathered. Officers began interviewing witnesses but faced a challenging task. Some residents expressed solidarity with the protagonist's cause, while others condemned their actions. Confusion reigned as officers attempted to sift through various accounts, gestures of support mixed with concerns over legal repercussions. In a surprisingly swift move, several frustrated homeowners took to social media to share their thoughts on the flooding incident. Posts began circulating highlighting years of negligence by the HOA and calling for accountability, a shift that sparked meaningful dialogue within the community about governance and responsibility. What had once been a whisper of dissent became a full-fledged discussion surrounding HOA practices and oversight. Amid this growing momentum, community meetings convened in homes and cafes alike. Residents discussed not just what had happened but also what needed to change moving forward. As conversations flourished, so too did a sense of camaraderie among those who had previously felt isolated in their frustrations. The protagonist's impromptu act became more than just an act of protest. It evolved into a rallying cry for many homeowners who longed for a voice in decisions affecting their lives. They were no longer merely victims of bureaucracy. They were now participants in shaping their community's future. In essence, the shifting landscape transformed perceptions within the neighborhood, from seeing themselves as mere homeowners subject to an uncompromising entity into empowered individuals ready to challenge authority when necessary. The concrete flooding initiated conversations that would reverberate far beyond that single event, a turning point toward potential reform and accountability for all involved. In the days following the concrete flooding, the consequences of the protagonist's actions began to unfold. On a personal level, they grappled with a mix of exhilaration and anxiety. The initial adrenaline rush was gradually replaced by a sobering realization of the potential repercussions, legal action from the HOA, possible fines, or even charges related to vandalism. Yet, amidst these concerns, there was also a profound sense of empowerment. For the first time in what felt like forever, they had taken decisive action rather than being at the mercy of bureaucracy. Conversely, the broader implications for HOA governance and community relationships were even more significant. The incident catalyzed a wave of change within the neighborhood. Residents who had once felt isolated in their frustrations found themselves rallying together, united by a common cause. This new solidarity began to shift power dynamics, with homeowners demanding greater transparency and accountability from the HOA. As community meetings became more frequent and robust, it was clear that the status quo was under threat. The complacent governance that had persisted for years was now subject to scrutiny. The HOA, in response to the upheaval, found itself cornered and defensive. There were discussions about tightening security measures and stricter enforcement of rules within the community. However, rather than quelling dissatisfaction, these measures further ignited conversations about autonomy and representation among residents. Many began questioning whether they had ever truly been represented by an organization that seemed more preoccupied with maintaining its authority than serving its constituents. As dialogues flourished within homes and public spaces alike, the protagonists noticed an awakening in their neighbors. People who had previously accepted decisions without question were now voicing their opinions forcefully. This newfound energy fostered collaborations on projects that uplifted community spirit, neighborhood cleanups, forums on homeowners' rights, and open discussions about how to hold the HOA accountable. Reflecting on their actions, the protagonist recognized that they unintentionally became a catalyst for a movement. What began as an individual protest evolved into a collective push for reform across their neighborhood. While the concrete flooding may have been seen by some as an act of vandalism, many others viewed it as a bold statement against complacency in governance. In this shift towards greater community engagement and empowerment lay an essential lesson. Individuals could challenge established norms and advocate for change when driven by shared values and collective frustration. With every conversation sparked, the protagonist came to understand that their act of defiance had created ripples not only within their immediate surroundings but would likely inspire accountability in homeowners associations elsewhere. A testament to how one person's actions can alter the fabric of a community. In the wake of the protagonist's audacious act, the community found itself at a crossroads, a moment ripe for reflection and transformation. The flooding of the HOA office with concrete served not only as a means of catharsis for individual frustrations but also as a powerful reminder of the strength that arises when people unite against perceived injustices. This incident exemplified a profound truth. Sometimes, it takes drastic measures to awaken a collective consciousness, galvanizing individuals to confront long-standing issues that have been quietly tolerated. Empowerment emerged as a central theme in the aftermath. Residents began to recognize their own agency, realizing that they were not merely victims of bureaucratic indifference but active participants in shaping their community's future. They learned that standing up against injustices, whether minor grievances or systemic failures, was crucial for fostering an environment where accountability and transparency could flourish. Conversations sparked within homes and public spaces encouraged neighbors to voice their opinions, share experiences, and collaborate on solutions. This newfound unity became a catalyst for change. Homeowners organized meetings not only to address past grievances but to formulate a vision for a more responsive and responsible HOA. They began demanding clear communication, regular updates on community issues, and active involvement in decision-making processes that directly affected them. As they pushed back against complacency, residents quickly established an expectation for accountability that reverberated throughout the neighborhood. Looking ahead, the protagonist's actions ignited discussions about reforming not just the HOA but other community organizations as well. The message was clear: those entrusted with governance must be held accountable to the very people they serve. The shift in dynamics encouraged homeowners to advocate for policies that would ensure greater oversight and representation, an essential step toward dismantling entrenched power structures that had failed them. Ultimately, this story serves as an inspiring reminder of what can happen when individuals refuse to accept the status quo. The courage to stand up and demand change can lead to profound transformations, empowering communities to reclaim their voices and advocate for justice. In every neighborhood across the country, similar stories can unfold. Each act of defiance can ripple outward, encouraging others to challenge authority and cultivate environments rooted in fairness and respect. As this chapter closes, it leaves behind not just a flooded office but a flourishing community ready to take charge. A call to action echoes throughout. The importance of vigilance, advocacy, and solidarity in the face of injustice is not just a lesson learned but an ongoing commitment that will shape their future.